Lorwyn, Chapter 18. Rhys stared coldly at the grip of Griffith's proffered sword. His former friend marched straight up to him until the weapon was less than an unwavering inch from Rhys's face. Rhys made sure his head remained just as still as the blade, the bridge of his nose and the sword's center fixed in a perfect static balance. His eyes bored into Griffith, and Rhys spoke. "Marilyn," he said, "get out of here. Do it now." "I won't leave you here alone," Marilyn replied. "That choice is not yours to make." Naf's deep, smooth voice was once more snarled and thunder. "Rhys and all who stand with him will answer for his crimes." "Take the blade, traitor." Griffith thrust the sword handle forward until it brushed against Rhys's nose. "I want to see you bleed." The main force of elves stood aside as the Tersen swept down the stairs and on through their ranks. The exquisite stopped 20 feet from Griffith and Rhys, glorious in his gleaming armor and fearsome in the torchlight. His horns shone like polished steel. "Dane Griffith," Naf's voice was clipped and formal. "Take your pack to the gate. If the Mornsong attempts to pass, kill her. If those mewling fairies interfere, kill them as well." Rhys saw the clique now, flying in a circle of mourning overhead, keening on the edge of the elf hearing for their lost kin. "Gladly, my Ter." Griffith dropped the silver blade and turned away before it landed on the ground. Rhys did not move. His eyes were fixed on Naf. The Tersen's expression was fierce and hungry, but he stood absolutely still, regal and magnanimous in his patience. Had he been an onlooker instead of the principal, Rhys would have pitied the scene. A lone, ragged outlaw against the magnificent commander of the Blessed in full martial regalia. He pushed this image aside. His status in the nation had no bearing anymore, especially not here. Naf and Griffith meant to utterly destroy him. Rank and respect would not save him, nor would the lack of it do him much harm. He would stand or fall solely on his skill, speed, and strength. If Naf and Griffith truly were superior, then Rhys would die, and a part of him knew that perhaps he ought to. By the infernal bog, his life would not end before he solved the riddles that had undone it, nor would he allow Aisling or Marilyn to suffer the same fate in his name. "Marilyn," Rhys said, "this is my affair, and I alone must settle it." Rhys broke eye contact with Naf and turned to Marilyn. "Don't argue." "All right," Marilyn said, "but we're not through, you and I. I'll find you when this is all over." Rhys nodded. "Until then." He heard the fairies' wings buzz and then a rash of excited voices. "Fairies, away! Twins, we have our orders. Let's get this fat elf on the road." Griffith snarled and sprang past Rhys, his squad moving behind him in perfect formation to follow his orders, even as the fairies boldly made it clear that no one was going through the gate. Naf marched forward until he stood 10 paces from Rhys. "Now, Kinslayer," he said, "pick up the sword." Rhys glanced down at the silver weapon. He had been torn between two competing disciplines for most of his life. The profound self-reflection of the treefolk sage and the strict military pragmatism of the elf nation. Kulfanor's teachings had brought him to this disaster in a sense, but they had also sustained him through the trials along the way. There was no reason to give up those teachings to resume the role of a warrior. The two paths he'd followed converged within him, and he drew strength from each. The blighted elf crouched slowly, deliberately, and took hold of the silver sword, clenching it tight. Rhys stood, hefting the broad blade, testing its weight, and eyeing its keen edge with an appreciative eye. It was a marvelous weapon, worthy of a faultless Dane, perhaps even worthy of an exquisite general. Rhys slashed the air. He nodded to Naf, and the army of elves and vinebred backed away, forming a circle around the two combatants. Rhys's mind whirred as he worked through a plan of attack. He was sure that he was at least Naf's equal, but there was no way the Tersen would allow himself to be defeated in this arena-like setting. An outlaw like Rhys had no rights, and an exquisite like Naf owed him no fair consideration. If things went poorly for Naf, his second-in-command would almost certainly step in to preserve the Tersen's honor. Naf might object, or even kill the interfering party afterward, but Rhys and the others would be just as dead. There was only one way to ensure Naf would attack alone. One way to establish that Naf and only Naf would strike a lethal blow. The Tersen drew his own silver sword, one that was even larger and more impressive than Rhys's borrowed blade. "Begin," he said. "I won't sully my sword with the first blow." Rhys shook his head. "No, Tersen, I will not give you the satisfaction. You promised me a hunter's death." "Your blasphemy knows no limit. You are nothing," Naf said. "You have no say in what constitutes a hunter's death." "Nor do you, Naf. You call yourself a hunter? What have you ever run down that wasn't half tamed and fat from a gamekeeper's food trough? You've spent too much time in your palace, Exquisite. Here in the woods we hunt things that hunt back." "I don't need to beat you," Rhys said loudly. "I only need to escape you. If you're half the hunter you pretend to be, your victory is assured. Otherwise your pack will see you for the weak, housebound dullet that you are." "You will be silent," Naf roared. He raised his sword and took a step forward. "Here," Rhys shouted, "let me sound the horn." He drew back Griffith's sword and slung it forward, putting his entire weight and all of the strength he had into the throw. The glittering blade tumbled end over end, whirring towards Naf's face. The Tersen nimbly stepped aside, letting the sword fly past him. It buried itself in the trunk of a nearby oak, sending a shudder up the tree that shook several leaves free. Rhys sprang towards the river as soon as the blade left his hand. He reached the edge of the hunter's circle and barreled into the throng of watching elves, knocking several back and clearing a small space where he could maneuver. Insults and blades shot past him as he climbed up onto the shoulders of two vine-bred winnowers. He planted his right foot on the vine-bred's head, bunched the long muscles in both legs, and sprang high into the air over the heads of Naf's pack. Rhys landed clear of the throng and rolled to his feet. Voices raged and snarled behind him. Swords cleared their scabbards all at once. Rhys saw the river approaching as he ran, and he dived, spearing through the air with his arms extended over his head. He hit the water and sliced through it, working against the current as he stayed underwater for as long as possible. When he surfaced, the sounds of pursuit were louder and angrier than ever. A few torches and arrows splashed around him, but the current and the wind and his own irregular path frustrated his pursuer's aim. He heard an actual horn peal, the clear, pure sound of an exquisite lord calling his dogs to heel. "Coward!" Naf raged. "I will use your remains as mulch in the nettle orchards!" There was a pause, and then the horn pealed again. In response, Rhys heard the entire pack surge forward, their feet shaking the ground and cries of bloodlust on their lips. Rhys redoubled his efforts, pulling his long, lean body across the river. As he splashed up the opposite bank, he turned back to Kinsbale. Dozens of the elves were already crossing the river, swimming as Rhys had. Naf himself had mounted his long-legged servant, and, as Rhys watched, he spurred it into the water. When the water was up to the tall steed's chest, it bounded forward, raising a giant splash every time it launched or landed. Rhys turned and sprinted into the forest. "The hunt is on," he told himself, "and I am the prey." With the lead they had, Ileona and her siblings could have scoured half the forest before Griffith and his pack caught up. Marilyn had other ideas. They had brought her along without hesitation, without even thinking about it, lifting the stranger with the same magic that they had used before, though this time it was the fairies who were bound and caged by Marilyn. "Here," Marilyn said, as if asking for another lump of sugar in her tea. Set us down here. They are too close behind us, Ileana said. I don't see Sig yet. We have to get there first. I made a bet. Down, Marilyn said. Here. The fairies slowed down and gingerly settled over the ground until Marilyn's feet touched the soil. You know what you are to do, the dark-haired woman said. Yes, they answered together. Off you go then, out of sight. Stand ready for my signal. Marilyn smiled slightly, but her voice was sharp and as cold as an icicle. Don't disappoint me, my dears. Ileana and her siblings spread out, rising up to the lowest branches of the tree behind Marilyn and hiding themselves among the leaves. Nothing the stranger did made any sense to Ileana, but she did not dare disobey. Not yet. Marilyn leaned casually against the bole of a tree and waited. The sounds of vine-bred feet shuffling drew near, and Ileana knew that meant the elves in the party were even nearer. Sure enough, moments later, Dane Griffith came out of the shadows, his long dagger ready by his side. You there, he called to Marilyn. Stand where you are. Or what? The woman replied. You've already threatened to kill me no matter what. You don't have a lot of threats left to make. Silence? Where are the fairies? You see, you shouldn't order the silence and then ask the question, Marilyn laughed. Makes your meaning a little murky. Monsong, I will kill you, but not before I learn where. You're hopeless. Too bad, Marilyn said. They're gone. Went on ahead to find the marrow. Left me all alone. Really? Griffith said. He waved his free hand and 6 elf archers stepped up behind him, their bows taut and their arrows trained on Marilyn. No, not really, Marilyn said. Now. Ileana, Endry, and Visa flashed past the elves with their blades drawn, briefly visible streaks of stardust that severed the bowlines of every archer before a single arrow saw flight. The projectiles never reached the ground, but seconds later, 3 of the 6 archers fell in perfect sequence, clutching at the arrows, transfixing their necks from throat to spine. The fairies plucked 3 more shafts from the 6th archer's quiver, and a moment later the remaining 3 elves fell screaming. That old trick, Visa said. You need some new material. That's a classic, Endry objected. What, in one ear and out the other is a classic? Ileana paused, waiting for Marilyn to contribute, to confirm or chastise this deviation from her orders. Of late, she'd grown to expect whichever of the big folk was nearest would invariably tell her to shut up or be quiet, or to go away. That she could stand. But when nothing but silence came, she found it so unsettling, especially after such a brilliant trick, that Ileana ended the discussion before the stranger spoke up. All right then, she said with finality. Classics. Griffith spat a curse at the fairies. He brandished his sword at Marilyn and said, They can't save you from this. Can too, can too. Just you watch. Hush now, Marilyn said. The fairy fell silent. He's mine. She walked slowly around Griffith, staying out of his lunging range, as she regarded him from head to toe, keeping her focus in motion. She walked in fits and starts to ensure he didn't time out her pace and strike that way. So how many more elves do you have, Dane Griffith? You personally under your command. What does Nath allow you? A half dozen? More? I'm not counting you, of course. Enough to bury you and your insect familiars. Marilyn chuckled breezily. I suppose the exact number doesn't matter. I just want to know how much it will take to clear you from the field. Griffith bristled. With a twitch of his horns, he summoned the rest of his rangers up to the edge of the shadows. His eyes flashed green, and Ileana knew that he was calling upon the strength of the forest, on the elf magic that sustained his pack, and using it to make himself stronger, faster, and more formidable. He tensed to pounce, waiting for the next move the stranger or her fairies made so that he could cut Marilyn to pieces before any more of his elves fell. I know all about the blessed, you see, Marilyn said. You've got nothing left to show me. Ileona felt the force swirling around Griffith and heard his long muscles tense. She very much wanted to see Marilyn run through with the elf's silver blade, but she couldn't allow that. "Stay out of this for now," Marilyn said to the fairies. Ileona forced herself to calm down, urging her siblings to do the same. "Come on then," Marilyn said to Griffith. "Let's sort this out, you and I. I don't have much time for you." All three fairies let out the same small cry as the elf Dane rushed forward. He was so fast, so sure, and it seemed like nothing could stop his blade from falling on Marilyn's face. And if the Dane missed, there were 6 battle-mad elves right behind him ready to finish the job. But the stranger clasped her hands and then opened them again, casting them out on each side. Ileona saw a sphere of smoke and fog appear around Marilyn, and then she heard the rustling of 100 brittle wings. Griffith was the first to reach the sphere, so he was the first to stop short. His pack rushed in around him and likewise became mired, their movements slow and sluggish. Their hooves all dug into the ground as they tried to continue forward, but their faces registered the bewilderment and panic of soldiers being ambushed from all sides. Marilyn laughed again. "Go away, Dane Griffith," she said. "I have important things to tend to, and no use for you." Marilyn closed her eyes and spread her arms, palm forward. Hazy smoke drifted out of her fingertips and rolled over the elves. The elves cried out as their bodies were snared in the fog, and their weapons fell from their hands, only to float in the arcane mists. Then Marilyn clapped her hands and the elves disappeared. Ileona blinked. When she opened her eyes, Marilyn was standing alone, without a wisp of smoke in sight. Rhys sprinted through the outermost edge of the forest that bordered Kinsbale. He didn't need to spare his legs, and he did need to get as far ahead as he could before Nath and the hunting party caught up to him, so he did not restrain himself. The forest floor blurred below his feet, and sweat streaked across his sharp features. He was alone and ridiculously outnumbered, but Rhys felt strong and unaccountably confident. He had never been the target of a hunt before, but that only meant no one had ever hunted prey quite like him. He knew how his people hunted, how to exploit their strict adherence to form. If Nath followed the traditional ways as rigidly as he enforced pack discipline, Rhys would have a chance. As the woods around him grew thicker and his progress slowed, Rhys changed course. He dug his hooves in and turned around, racing back along his own path for 20 paces before springing up into the trees. He methodically scrabbled through the branches, working his steady way around and behind his pursuers. By the time the trackers realized he had doubled back, he would be right where he needed to be, at Nath's throat. The 4-footed tread of the cuff-hounds worried him. They were the swiftest and the surest of his pursuers, but he had no wish to harm the magnificent beasts. Rhys froze and stopped breathing as the hounds raced through the distant brush 20 yards below. He might have no choice if the hounds found him too far ahead of Nath. He swung out and hurled himself onto a new branch, putting more distance between himself and the dogs. "There he is!" A chorus of elf voices answered the first, confirming what it saw, calling the others to come and see, calling for Nath himself. Rhys's ears flattened, and he gathered his strength. This was not the way he had intended to fight this fight, nor where. The dogs were too close and Nath too far away. So be it, he thought. He kicked his feet out as he swung by his arms from a stout, thick branch, turning a graceful somersault before landing lightly on his hooves, facing the trackers. The one who had seen him first sprang forward with his sword extended. Rhys had no blade with which to parry, and he needed his arms undamaged, so he dropped to the ground and lashed out with both hooves. The elf tracker's knee cracked and bent backwards, and he fell heavily on top of Rhys. Rhys caught the tracker's sword arm and twisted the long blade free. It fell with its tip in the dirt, and Rhys plucked it free as it rolled away from his stricken foe. An archer stepped forward. "Bog it," he said, and knocked an arrow. 4 other elves did the same, Without another word, each drew back a bolt and simultaneously let them fly. Rhys folded his arms tight against his ribs and threw himself to the side. He was quick enough to avoid the first 3 arrows, but the last 2 archers corrected their aim enough to follow him across the glade. One of these bolts ripped through his leggings and cut a shallow slash across his calf muscle. The other punched through the meaty part of his thigh, spinning him around so that he landed clumsily on his face. Rhys instantly reached down with both hands, taking hold of the dripping arrowhead and the leafy plumes. He snapped the shaft off on either side of his leg, emptied his hands, and then he slid the remainder free from the raw muscle. It was quick, but it was not clean, and the searing throb left behind rendered the whole leg nearly useless. The archers had prepared another volley, but their leader stopped them with a raised hand. Rhys watched the elf's ears twitch and his lips curl into a cruel smile. "Leave him to the dogs," the elf said, over the pounding of his ears, that was answered beat for beat by the drum in his legs. Rhys at last heard the sound of a sure-footed cuff-hound bearing down on him. He struggled to his feet, just as the first yellow-brown striped body bounded into view, followed immediately by 4 of his fellows. Their heads were sleek and triangular, their bodies long and lean and rippling under their silky pelts. They were true gilt-leaf hunters, beautiful and strong, disciplined and relentless, faster than lightning and far deadlier. Rhys crouched as the lead dog came within striking distance. He pressed his palm into the wound on his leg, waited for the cuff-hound to leap, and then sprang straight up into the air. Naf's cuff-hounds were exceptionally well trained, though this was a most unexpected reaction from their prey. The dogs never wavered from their target. Sharp canine teeth ripped through the flesh on his shins and ankles. They were painful wounds, but not lethal ones, only intended to bring the quarry down. Even the long, graceful muzzles that clamped onto his legs didn't bite hard enough to crack the bones. Rhys hung suspended for a moment, his lower half lost amid a swarm of snarling fur. He fell among the dogs, bitten and trampled as he curled into a ball and cradled his arms against his torso. The assault continued until a strong, familiar voice called out, "Off!" Naf's hounds responded instantly to their master's voice, disengaging from Rhys without doing any more damage. The cuff-hounds retreated, growling as they backed away from him. Each hound then sat on its haunches in a semicircle around Rhys and fell silent. Rhys looked up. Naf's assembled hunting party was spread out among the trees, surrounding the dogs, which in turn surrounded Rhys. The Tersan himself rode into the clearing on his sunrise yellow servan, his cape sweeping majestically behind him. Naf dismounted 10 paces from Rhys, disdainfully turning his back on his prey, and raised his arms in triumph, a ceremonial dagger clenched in his fist. The pack cheered, and many of them hurled abuse at Rhys's huddled body. He unfolded himself and tried to rise, but his legs barely supported his weight. Grimacing in pain, Rhys settled onto his knees and cupped his elbows into his hands. The ground beneath him was wet and slick. He shuddered. "You ran, Rabbit," Naf said, "but now your race is run." His voice sang out loudly over the clearing. "Once you were an elf, a faultless of the gilt-leaf pack, but you deserve to be hunted like the low wretch you are. You will die here, outlaw. I call you traitor and kinslayer. You will die wallowing in your own blood." He raised his voice in an order to his hunters. "I am the master of this hunt. The kill is mine." Returning to Rhys, he said, "And I swear to you, once you are dead, and we have desecrated your unworthy corpse, we will leave it here for the carrion birds." Naf charged Rhys with a yell and lashed out with his dagger, aiming for one clean cut across the throat. Rhys slammed his hands onto the ground, pushed himself up, and caught Naf's arm mid-swing, the tip of the dagger scoring the flesh on Rhys's jaw. Rhys tightened his grip as Naf pressed down. His arms were still strong, however, and the Tersan could not force the blade any closer. When Naf reversed himself and tried to pull back, Rhys clung all the tighter, letting the Tersen haul him bodily from the forest floor. "Why can't you just die?" Naf spat at him. Rhys's right hand shot from Naf's arms to the Tersen's throat. Naf grunted and coughed, grasping Rhys's forearm with his free hand, allowing Rhys to settle back to the ground. Rhys prepared to haul himself back up, to force Naf to bear his weight, but the Tersen surprised him. Naf released the arm that was choking him and drove his sharp fist deep into Rhys's belly. The punch forced all the air from Rhys's lungs, but he maintained his grip on Naf. The Tersen drew his fist back and rammed it into Rhys's stomach again and again. Each new blow weakened Rhys's grip. He coughed up a bloody froth and his vision went red. Digging his fingers into Naf's windpipe, Rhys let go of the Tersen's dagger arm and pulled himself up to Naf's chest. He wrapped his free arm around the Tersen's shoulder, then relaxed his grip on Naf's throat. He clamped onto Naf's right horn at the base just as the Tersen plunged his dagger into Rhys's lower back. Rhys hissed in agony, but Naf's reaction was far more violent. With a sudden burst of strength, Naf tossed his head and lunged back, pulling Rhys along with him. Rhys used this momentum to pull himself farther up Naf's body. As the Tersen continued to thrash, Rhys slung himself around behind Naf and grabbed both of the Tersen's horns in an iron grip. "Get off me! Get off!" Rhys let his muscles go slack, his whole body hanging from the Tersen's horns. As his weight dragged Naf's head down, Rhys summoned all his strength in his arms and shoulders. When his useless legs hit the dirt, Rhys pivoted at the waist. He gave a short, brutal jerk, and a sickeningly loud crack echoed off the trees. Naf screamed, as did all the elves within eyeshot. The Tersen stumbled and flailed, but Rhys held on. There was something heavy and jagged in his hand, but amid the chaos he was unsure of what it was, unsure of his own senses. The furious sounds in the clearing died in his ears as Rhys raised his hand and stared at the contents. Naf's horn had broken off near the base. It was solid and denser than Rhys expected. Then Naf's dagger found his ribcage. Rhys felt cold pain spread through his chest. He opened his hand, let Naf's horn fall, and then he clamped it onto the Tersen's jaw. Naf bit down on Rhys's thumb. It was painful but bearable. A chill, drowsy feeling spread down Rhys's spine, from his brain to his stomach. He tightened his grip on Naf's chin and remaining horn. "This kill is mine," Rhys said, and then he twisted the Tersen's head until Naf's face glared down over his own shoulder blades. Tersen Naf of the Giltleaf's body went slack, and he let it fall to the ground. He worked his thumb out of Naf's teeth and rolled clear, scooping up the broken horn as well. The lead archer was the first to charge, and he closed in on Rhys a full 5 steps before anyone else. He caught the sharp tip of Naf's broken horn directly in the heart. Rhys pulled himself up to one knee before the dead elf fell. He felt a dull throbbing in his broken horns. The duel had broken the glamour that had concealed his disfigurement. He wondered if Naf had seen the truth as he died. Wobbling, still clutching the horn, Rhys stood on his shaky legs and pointed the tip of Naf's pride at the assembled hunters. "Whoever else wants to die on the Tersen's horn should step forward," he said. The cuffhounds whined, and Rhys silenced them with a withering glare. Their pack leader was dead, blighted and murdered. There were hisses and whispers as the assembly saw the state of Rhys's horns. Shorn of glamour. "Eye blight," they said, but it would take a stronger voice than Rhys to make the cuffhounds attack him, and no such voice was present. Rhys turned back to Naf's body. He stared at the hard, withered features and the cracked, crumbling horns. Rhys's glamour was not the only mask to have slipped during the fight. The glorious and noble Tersen of the Giltleaf stood revealed as a hardened, weathered thing that looked as drawn and tough as a smoke-cured carcass. Exquisite no longer. Rhys stared at Naf's appalling features, knowing exactly how and why the old man had hidden the signs of his visible decline. It didn't matter that he was as fast and strong as any he commanded. He was wizened, drawn. Generals like Naf had drummed into him the concept of gilt-leaf honor, the notion that hiding behind a glamour was beneath a hunter's dignity. Yet here Naf was, mourned despite his imperfection. Perhaps there was a place for Rhys in the blessed nation after all. But not today. Rhys took a single step forward and almost lost his balance, but caught himself. He placed 2 fingers at the corners of his mouth and whistled. Naf's servant snorted. "Here," he snapped. The confused animal pawed the ground and tossed its head, but slowly moved closer to Rhys. Fighting the urge to run or lunge, Rhys slowly took the 2 steps that separated him from the servant. His arms were still strong, and it was not difficult to swing himself up onto the servant's back. He recited one of the healing rituals, pressing his fingers deep into the arrow wound at his thigh. If his strength held, he would be able to walk again by the time he crossed the river. "Burn Naf with honor," he said. He raised the Tersen's broken horn high for all to see. No word of his disgrace need ever reach the nation, or of his deception. If you value his memory, honor it. The elf pack stood in mute shock. "Highblight," a lone elf whispered. "Scarblade traitor." "I am," Rhys agreed, "but I killed my enemy today. You will not have that pleasure." He spurred the servant so that it reared, and its flashing legs sent the elves around it scurrying for safety. Rhys guided the steed out of the clearing and back into the dense woods without resistance from the elves. He rode north, away from Kinsbale in case the hunters did decide to pursue him. He would put some distance between them, and then double back once more for the village on one of the fastest mounts in all of Lorwyn.